The UK has always been an important location throughout punk history. Not only was it the birthplace of some of the genre's earliest big names, such as The Clash, the Sex Pistols, and the Buzzcocks, but it also birthed a number of different punk subgenres that still retain strong followings in the scene to this day. Like all musical subgenres, each of these offshoots had one or two bands that pioneered the blueprint for both the sound and the scene. And specifically in the context of crust punk and D-beat, I can think of two bands that really set the stage, one of which was responsible for defining the sound as we know it today. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and if you're a fan of crust punk, D-beat, crossover thrash, or really just hardcore punk in general, then I'm sure you're familiar with the everlasting impact of the one and only Discharge. As usual, I'll be giving a historical overview of their career as well as some of my personal feelings towards their music, along with a short synopsis of the D-beat genre that spawned as a result of their influence. Before we get started though, I just want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Discharge songs, and I'll be sure to leave a link to that in the description below. And lastly, if you are interested in weekly videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways! The story of Discharge begins in 1977 in the town of Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire County. The band's original lineup consisted of vocalist Tez Roberts, guitarist Rainey and Bones Roberts, bassist Nigel Bamford, and Akko Axon on drums. After recruiting Tanya Rich as their manager, the band promptly got to work on recording a demo and started playing shows supporting other punk bands in their local area before they started touring the larger UK. Before they could get a chance to get to work on their first official release though, both Akko and Bamford would step down from the band, leaving them without a rhythm section entirely. In response to this, Tez Roberts would take over the role as the band's drummer while Rainey filled the role of bassist. Once their instrumental lineup had filled out, Discharge would then recruit their roadie Kelvin Cal Morris to be their new vocalist. With the new lineup, the band would ditch their previous Clash Sex Pistols inspired material for a much more raw hardcore sound, turning up the distortion on both the guitar and bass along with cranking up the tempo, and of course adding Cal Morris's iconic shouted and screamed vocals. The band would also incorporate much darker political lyrics and would focus them on anarchist and anti-war themes. On the topic of their demo though, it doesn't really sound anything like Discharge as we know them today. They actually used to sound a lot more like the Subhumans or Crust, which I think makes a lot of sense, as you could argue that all three of those bands were more or less direct offshoots of the 70s classics like The Damned and the Sex Pistols. In the year 1980, Discharge would sign with the punk label Clay Records, and the band would release 3 7-inch EPs titled Fight Back, Realities of War, and Decontrol. Before the year was over, however, Tez Roberts would part ways with the band, and he was replaced by drummer David Ellsmere. Ellsmere would not stay long, however, and following his departure, Veruca's drummer Gary Maloney would take over the role. With Maloney on board, Discharge would then record and release a longer EP titled Why in 1981. The album's artwork showed corpses of dead civilians and further emphasized the band's anti-war ideals. Many of the tracks on Why also set the template for the crust punk genre that would break out of the UK scene later on in the 80s, and you could certainly argue that it's the first, if not one of the first, crust punk albums ever made. The Why EP is also one of the earliest examples of metal-influenced punk rock, and the early Discharge stuff would have a great deal of influence on the crossover thrash scene of the late 80s as well. After a reasonable amount of shows and tours in support of Why, Discharge would return to the studio in early 1982 to record their first full-length album, Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing. If Why had garnered Discharge a sizable following in the punk scene, Hear Nothing, See Nothing multiplied it tenfold. After the album's release, the band would embark on numerous tours throughout the UK with bands like GBH and The Exploited, before taking their band out to punk scenes all around the world. And finally, before 1982 was over, Discharge would also release a single titled State Violence, State Control. Discharge would tour all over Europe and North America, developing followings in various different countries including Sweden, Italy, Finland, Canada, and the United States. On one of their first tours in North America, the band actually had trouble getting into Canada from the US, as the border guards thought they looked like animals. Around 1983, Discharge would go through another lineup change when Bones Roberts left the band to form Broken Bones with his brother Tez. He would be replaced by Peter Pooch Pertil, and upon his arrival, the band would take on a sound heavily influenced by traditional heavy metal. Although their 1983 release, Warning, Her Majesty's Government Can Seriously Damage Your Health, remains fairly reminiscent of their pre-existing hardcore material, the metal influence is very apparent, and it isn't hard to see that they were headed in a more metal direction. The band would also release 2 singles between the years of 1983 and 84, as well as a compilation of all their previous singles titled Never Again. The band would then briefly take on a crossover thrash sound for the release of their 1985 single Ignorance before the departures of both Crutrell and Maloney. The two of them would go on to form the crossover band Hell's Bells and were replaced by guitarist Les Hunt and drummer Mickey Gibson. The band would also add guitarist Stephen Fish Brooks before recording their second full-length album in 1986. I'm sure if you're familiar with Discharge, you know what a flop this record was and why fans hated it so much, but just in case you don't, please allow me to provide some background information. Despite the promising crossover sound of the Ignorance single, Brave New World saw the band shift towards a more accessible mainstream metal sound reminiscent of the popular glam metal style. The band ditched the fast tempos of their previous few releases for much slower rock-type grooves, and the shouted vocals were replaced with falsetto ones. Cal Morris later blamed this on his rediscovery of Led Zeppelin in the late 80s. The band would go on a few disastrous tours throughout the UK, US, and Canada, as their new hair metal sound was not well received by their punk fans. In fact, at a show in New York City, Bad Brains vocalist HR dumped ice on the band while they were playing. The record also received a great deal of negative responses from critics as well, and AllMusic's Eduardo Rivadavia went as far to say that it may as well have been credited to a different band entirely. Discouraged by the flop of the album, Cal Morris would depart from the band and was briefly replaced by former Wrathchild vocalist Rob Berkeley before the band's first breakup in 1987. Discharge would remain dormant for 3 years after their breakup in 1987, until the band was reformed by Cal Morris in 1990. The new lineup consisted of Andy Green on guitar, Anthony Morgan on bass, and Gary Maloney on drums. After releasing 2 live albums, the band would then get to work on their third full-length album, Massacre Divine. The album would be released through Clay Records and saw the band return to a harder heavy metal sound much closer to that of the Ignorant single from 1985. The album draws much of its inspiration from British metal bands such as Motorhead and Venom, as well as an apparent influence from AC/DC, especially with Cal Morris's vocals. The band would follow up this release with a series of tours, including their first ever Japanese tour, but the album was still met with a negative reception from fans. The band would then release their 1993 follow-up Shootin' Up the World and adopt a heavier thrash metal sound. Despite their best efforts though, the record still received a disappointed reaction from their fanbase. Although Discharge seemed to want to continue playing as a metal band, it just never really seemed to click with their audience, and after the flop of the 1993 release and several member changes, the band would part ways once more in 1999. Like I said, up until this point, Discharge had still been trying to make a name for themselves as a metal band, but no matter what angle they tried, nothing seemed to work. After a series of unsuccessful metal albums, the band had already broken up twice, but everything was about to change once they reunited again in the early 2000s. After a party hosted by original bassist Nigel Bamford, the classic Discharge lineup from the early 80s decided to reunite for one final shot at a comeback. Although Bamford would not take part in the reunion, Tez, Bones, and Rainey would all return to the band, and they would begin work on a new album shortly after reuniting in 2001. The 2002 self-title would be released through Sanctuary Records and saw the band return to the politically charged hardcore punk formula that had made them a staple back in 1982. However, all of the band's years in the metal world hadn't been for nothing, as the album featured a number of metal-influenced riffs and solos to give it an extra punch. Despite the promising record after his discouraging years in the band, Cal Morris did not want to tour for promotion and would resign from the band in 2003. He would be replaced by Anthony Rat Martin of the Verruchers, and the band would continue on with him for a number of years. Discharge would have a few minor releases throughout the mid to late 2000s, kicked off with a split with the Spanish D-beat band MG15 in 2005. The band would then release the single The Beginning of the End in 2006 before parting ways with Tez Roberts later that year. He would be replaced by Dave Caution, and with Dave on board, the band would return to the studio to record their 6th full-length album, Desensitized, in 2008. The album was released through Vile Records in 2009, and the band would embark on various tours, including one in Japan where they would record a live EP. Come the 2010s, Discharge would drop 2 more EPs, one of them being a split with the American band Up With Their Heads in 2012. Then, after 2 more years of touring and festival dates, Rat Martin would resign from the band in 2014. Although Rat had established himself as the band's vocalist for over a decade, his departure wasn't about to stop them, and they would recruit American punk vocalist Jeff J.J. Yaniak later in 2014. Tez Roberts would also return to the band in 2014 as a rhythm guitarist and fill out Discharge's lineup as a 5-piece once more. In June of 2015, the band would premiere the new song New World Order before the release of their 2016 full-length End of Days. The album dropped on April 29th of that year through Nuclear Blast Records and remains Discharge's most recent release to this date. Despite having over a decade of disappointing releases, Discharge still remains a very important band in the crust punk scene and really in hardcore punk overall. And this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't make note of just how big an impact they had on the genre. If you're a Discharge fan, you're probably familiar with the term D-beat, but just in case you aren't, that entire genre was derived from their sound. Many D-beat bands will also pay homage to Discharge by starting their band names with Dis in addition to writing similar sounding music. I'll definitely cover this stuff in greater detail when I do a more in-depth video on crust punk and D-beat, but a few D-beat bands I think are worth checking out include Skit System, Disclose, Disgust, Tragedy, and Disrupt. I also mentioned the band Broken Bones earlier, which was an offshoot of Discharge started by Tez and Bones Roberts, and if you haven't heard those guys, they're certainly worth a listen too. And I know they may not be the first thing that comes to mind when some of us think D-beat, but I think the UK crust band Doom is worth mentioning here too. The Discharge influence is certainly there, and they're also just a super important band for the UK crust scene overall. If you're into this kind of stuff and you haven't listened to them, I highly recommend checking them out. It wasn't just the crust punk scene that Discharge had a lasting impact on though. A lot of the classic New York hardcore bands have cited them as an important influence, and I think it's pretty safe to say they had a lasting impact impact on thrash metal and crossover too. Namely because they were one of the first bands to blend punk and metal in the early 80s. I also think we have Discharge to thank for the power violence and grindcore genres as well. Although it may not be as obvious of an influence there, I think at the very least Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing set the stage for bands like Siege and Napalm Death to make a mark on the scene the way they did in the mid-80s. Despite Discharge's late 80s and early 90s stuff being rather subpar, I think with how big of an impact their first full-length had, they pretty much secured themselves a seat at the classics table no matter what. Plus, I have to say they had a really strong comeback with their self-titled in 2002, and they've stayed pretty consistent ever since. As far as my personal thoughts on Discharge go, I would definitely consider myself a fan. There's certainly other crust punk bands I'd say I like more, but I'm not going to deny that they wouldn't exist, or at least wouldn't be the same without Discharge. I'm not the biggest fan of their stuff from the late 80s and early 90s, but other than that, I'd say everything else in their discography is fantastic, and certainly earns them their place as one of the most influential hardcore bands of all time. Anyways, I'd say that sums up our little history lesson on Discharge here. I apologize for the late upload. I've been adjusting to a new schedule in the past couple weeks. But that's enough from me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite Discharge album? Are you into D-Beat at all? If so, what's your favorite band? Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.